Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Reed Morrison had built his empire the hard way. Growing up in the Rust Belt with a father who drank away every paycheck and a mother who cleaned houses to keep food on the table, he learned early that the world owed him nothing. By 35, he owned Morrison Construction, a company that had grown from a single truck and a dream into a multi-million-dollar operation specializing in luxury developments across 3 states. The scars on his knuckles told stories of his youth, street fights, construction accidents, and the kind of hard labor that either broke a man or forged him into something unbreakable. Reed had chosen the latter. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing, and his handshake could crush bones if he wanted it to. Those who worked for him respected him not just for his success, but for the quiet intensity that suggested crossing Reed Morrison would be the last mistake they ever made. He'd met Brooke Sterling at a charity gala 5 years ago. She was 28, blonde, beautiful in that polished way that came from never wanting for anything. Her father, Bob Sterling, owned Sterling Financial Services, a boutique investment firm that catered to the wealthy. Her mother, Pat, spent her days at the country club and her evenings hosting dinner parties for Millfield's elite. Brooke had seemed different then. Charming, witty, with just enough edge to intrigue a man like Reed. Their wedding had been the social event of the season. Reed remembered standing at the altar, watching Brooke glide down the aisle in a dress that cost more than most people made in a year, thinking he'd finally achieved something his father never could: respectability. The Sterling name opened doors that Morrison Construction's profits alone couldn't budge. When Grace was born 3 years ago, Reed thought his life was complete. The little girl with her mother's blonde curls and his own determined chin represented everything he'd fought to build. He would give her the childhood he'd never had: stability, security, love without conditions. Watching her take her first steps in their sprawling suburban home, Reed had felt something he'd never experienced before: pure, uncomplicated happiness. But Reed Morrison was a man who noticed details. He'd survived by reading people, by catching the small tells that revealed their true intentions. And lately, he'd been noticing things about his wife that didn't add up. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. The changes had started small. Brooke began working out more, buying new clothes, changing her perfume. She claimed she was taking art classes on Thursday evenings, but when Reed drove by the community center where she said the classes were held, the parking lot was always empty. Her phone, once carelessly left on counters and tables, now never left her side. Reed had built his business on information. Before breaking ground on any project, he researched everything: soil composition, zoning laws, competition, local politics. When something didn't feel right about his marriage, he applied the same methodical approach. He hired Trevor Blake, a private investigator who'd done background checks for Morrison Construction's larger contracts. The photos Blake delivered 2 weeks later confirmed what Reed's instincts had been screaming. Brooke entering the Grandview Hotel with Kyle Brennan, a real estate developer Reed knew by reputation. Brennan was old money, inherited wealth, Ivy League education, the kind of man who'd never worked a day of real labor in his life. In the photos, Brooke looked at Brennan the way she used to look at Reed, before familiarity had bred contempt. Kyle Brennan represented everything Reed despised about the wealthy elite. While Reed had clawed his way up from nothing, Brennan had been handed opportunities on silver platters. His development projects were financed by Daddy's trust fund, his business deals smoothed by family connections. He was married to Amanda Brennan, a surgeon who worked 16-hour days while Kyle played golf and collected vintage cars. Reed studied the surveillance photos with the same detachment he brought to construction blueprints. The timestamps told a story of deception spanning 3 months. Thursday art classes were actually Thursday afternoons at the Grandview. The new workout routine was toning her body for another man. The perfume was chosen for Kyle's preferences, not Reed's. But what cut deepest wasn't the adultery itself. It was the casualness of it. In one photo, Brooke was laughing at something Kyle had said, her hand on his arm, looking genuinely happy in a way Reed couldn't remember seeing in months. She wasn't just cheating. She was falling in love with someone else. Reed had always prided himself on control. In business, he planned every move 3 steps ahead. In life, he believed preparation and determination could overcome any obstacle. But sitting in his home office, looking at evidence of his wife's betrayal, he felt something dangerous stirring in his chest. Not just anger, but the cold, calculating fury that had gotten him through his worst days growing up. The Reed Morrison who'd survived his father's rages and built an empire from nothing wasn't the same man who'd learned to smile at country club dinners and make small talk with Brooke's friends. That version of himself had been a performance, a careful construction designed to fit into Brooke's world. But beneath the veneer of respectability, the man who'd once put 3 guys in the hospital for trying to steal his lunch money was still very much alive. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Pat Sterling's voice was syrupy sweet, the same tone she used when asking Reed to donate to her latest charity project. "Reed, darling, I hope you don't mind, but we're keeping Grace for dinner tonight. Bob's been teaching her to play chess, and she's just fascinated. You know how grandparents are." Reed had been reviewing contracts, but something in Pat's tone made him pause. "That's fine. I'll pick her up after my meeting." "Oh, no rush at all. Take your time." The meeting ended earlier than expected. As Reed drove toward the Sterling's mansion in Millfield's most exclusive neighborhood, he reflected on his relationship with Brooke's parents. Bob Sterling had never quite hidden his disappointment that his daughter had married beneath her station. The man had a way of asking about Reed's business that made legitimate success sound somehow dirty. Pat was more subtle, but equally dismissive, always finding ways to remind Reed that the Morrison name lacked the Sterling family's generations of respectability. They tolerated him because he was successful, because he could afford to keep their daughter in the lifestyle she expected. But Reed had always sensed they were waiting for him to fail, to prove their initial judgment correct. The Sterling house sat on 2 acres of manicured lawn, a colonial revival that screamed old money. Reed parked in the circular driveway and walked toward the front door, but the sound of voices from the garden room made him pause. Through the French doors, he could see Grace sitting at a small table, tears streaming down her face. "Clean the toilet again." Bob Sterling's voice carried clearly through the glass. "You're just like your father, a loser who can't do anything right the first time." Pat Sterling stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her 3-year-old granddaughter struggle with a cleaning brush that was too big for her small hands. "Maybe if she had better breeding, she'd learn faster," Pat said with casual cruelty. "But what can you expect from that family?" Reed's hand was on the door handle when he heard another voice, Brooke's laughter, light and musical, as if watching her daughter being humiliated was the most entertaining thing in the world. "You're so right, Mother," Brooke said. "Grace needs to learn that actions have consequences." Reed never learned that lesson, so someone has to teach it to her. Reed stood frozen, watching his 3-year-old daughter cry as she tried to clean a toilet with shaking hands while the adults in her life, the people who were supposed to protect her, mocked her for sharing his blood. The sight burned itself into his memory with perfect clarity. Grace's tear-stained face, the Sterling's smug expressions, and Brooke's casual betrayal, not just of him, but of their child. In that moment, Reed Morrison died. What remained was something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and all the resources in the world to make his enemies pay. He turned away from the door and walked back to his truck. He had calls to make. Chapter 4. The First Dominoes. Reed drove home in perfect silence, his mind already 3 moves ahead. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he'd made his first decision. He called Trevor Blake. "I need everything," Reed said without preamble. Bob Sterling, Pat Sterling, Kyle Brennan. Financial records, business dealings, personal habits, family connections, weaknesses. Everything. That's going to cost. Money isn't an object. I want information that can destroy them. And I want it fast. His second call was to Marcus Webb, his lawyer, and one of the few people who knew Reed's real history. Webb had handled the legal work when Reed bought Morrison Construction from his former boss, and he'd stayed clean through some very gray areas of Reed's business expansion. Marcus, I need you to review something for me. The Sterling house. Bob used Morrison Construction for the renovation work 5 years ago, right? Yeah, you practically gave him the job at cost. Wedding present for Brooke. Who hold the primary mortgage? Sterling Financial Services holds it themselves. Why? Reed smiled for the first time all day. Because Bob Sterling made a mistake. He used his own company to finance his house, and I'm the majority shareholder. There was silence on the other end. Reed, weren't you telling me? 6 months ago, when Sterling Financial needed capital for that shopping center development, they came to me. I bought 45% of the company through shell corporations. Bob thinks he's dealing with anonymous investors from Chicago. Jesus Christ, Reed. You own almost half of Sterling Financial. I own enough to call in debts when I want to. And Bob Sterling is about to discover that his house payment is past due. Reed's third call was to Danny Rodriguez, his most trusted foreman and the closest thing he had to a friend. Danny had grown up 3 blocks from Reed, and he was one of the few people who remembered what Reed had been like before he'd learned to wear suits and smile at dinner parties. Danny, I need a favor. That demolition crew we use for the big jobs, are they available for freelance work? Depends on what you need, boss. I need them to be very good at their jobs and very bad at remembering details. Danny was quiet for a moment. This about Brooke? Reed had never told Danny about the affair, but Danny had eyes. He'd noticed the changes in Reed's marriage the same way he noticed structural problems in buildings. This is about protecting Grace, Reed said finally. Then you've got whatever you need. By the time Brooke returned home with Grace that evening, Reed had set the first phase of his plan in motion. He watched his wife tuck their daughter into bed, kissing Grace's forehead with what looked like genuine affection. The sight might have confused him once, but Reed now understood that Brooke was capable of loving Grace while simultaneously using her as a weapon against him. How was your evening? Brooke asked as she joined him in the living room. Productive, Reed replied, not looking up from his tablet where he was reviewing the financial documents Trevor Blake had already started sending. How was Grace? Oh, you know how my parents are. They spoil her rotten. Brooke's lie came easily, without even a flicker of guilt crossing her face. Reed nodded, making a mental note. He was beginning to understand that his wife wasn't just unfaithful, she was fundamentally cruel. The woman he'd married had hidden her true nature behind charm and beauty, but when she thought no one was watching, the mask slipped. I'm going to be working late the next few nights, he said. Big project coming up. Of course, darling. You work so hard. Reed finally looked at her, studying the face he'd once thought he loved. Brooke was still beautiful, but now he could see the calculation behind her smile, the way she measured every interaction for what she could gain from it. The Sterling house payment is due tomorrow, he said casually. I noticed it when I was reviewing our accounts. Oh, that's fine. Daddy handles all that through the company. Reed smiled. I'm sure he does. As Brooke headed upstairs, already reaching for her phone to text Kyle Brennan, Reed opened his laptop and began typing. The email went to 3 shell companies he'd established for exactly this kind of situation. By morning, Bob Sterling would receive notices that his loan had been called in, his payment was 30 days past due, and Sterling Financial Services was demanding immediate payment in full. The house that had witnessed his daughter's humiliation would be the first casualty in a war Bob Sterling didn't even know had started. Chapter 5. The Hunter Becomes Hunted. Kyle Brennan lived in a world where problems were solved with phone calls and connections. His grandfather had built Brennan Development into a regional powerhouse. His father had maintained the empire, and Kyle had inherited both the wealth and the arrogance that came with it. At 32, he'd never faced a real consequence for his actions because his family's money had always made problems disappear. Reed studied Kyle's routine with the same attention he'd once applied to tracking construction schedules. Blake's surveillance revealed a man of predictable habits. Morning workouts and exclusive gym, lunch meetings at the country club, afternoon rounds of golf, evenings spent either with his wife Amanda or his mistress Brooke. Kyle moved through life with the casual confidence of someone who believed the world existed for his convenience. But Kyle had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated Reed Morrison. Reed's first move was subtle. Morrison Construction had been subcontracted for foundation work on Brennan Development's latest project, a luxury shopping complex that represented Kyle's attempt to prove himself to his father. Reed's crew had done excellent work, but now Reed made a single phone call to Danny Rodriguez. "I need you to find some problems with the Brennan project," Reed said. "Nothing dangerous, but enough to fail inspection." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that require tearing up everything we've already done and starting over. The kind that cost millions in delays and materials." 3 days later, city inspectors discovered foundation irregularities that would require complete reconstruction. Kyle's project, already operating on tight margins, faced cost overruns that would destroy his profit margins and his reputation. When Kyle called Reed demanding explanations, Reed's voice was perfectly professional. "I'm as surprised as you are, Kyle. My crew did everything by the book. Sometimes these things just happen in construction." But Reed was just getting started. His second move targeted Kyle's marriage. Amanda Brennan was a cardiac surgeon who worked brutal hours at St. Mary's Hospital. She was brilliant, dedicated, and completely unaware that her husband was cheating on her with Reed's wife. Reed could have simply told her about the affair, but that would have been too simple, too clean. Instead, Reed arranged for Amanda to discover it herself in the most devastating way possible. He hired a florist to deliver arrangements to Kyle's office every Thursday. The same day, Kyle met Brooke at the Grandview Hotel. The card was signed, "Your Thursday Girl," in handwriting that matched Brooke's. Reed made sure the deliveries arrived when Amanda was most likely to visit Kyle's office, which happened every Thursday when her surgery schedule allowed for lunch. The genius of the plan was its subtlety. Reed wasn't revealing the affair directly. He was letting Kyle's own arrogance expose it. Kyle, flattered by what he thought were romantic gestures from Brooke, displayed the flowers prominently. He even mentioned his Thursday Girl to colleagues, thinking he was being clever and mysterious. Amanda Brennan was a woman who'd earned her position through intelligence and observation. When she noticed the pattern, flowers every Thursday, Kyle's improved mood on Thursday evenings, his sudden interest in working late, she began investigating on her own. It took her 2 weeks to follow Kyle to the Grandview Hotel and see him embrace Brooke in the lobby. Reed was in his office when Kyle burst through the door, his face red with rage and panic. "You son of a bitch!" Kyle shouted. "You've been watching us." Reed looked up from his computer with mild surprise. "I'm sorry. Amanda knows. She's filing for divorce, and she's taking half of everything I own." "I'm not sure what you're talking about, Kyle. Are you feeling all right?" Kyle advanced toward Reed's desk, his hands clenched into fists. Reed didn't move, but something in his eyes made Kyle stop short. For the first time in his privileged life, Kyle Brennan was looking at a man who'd grown up fighting for survival, and some primitive instinct warned him that this confrontation wouldn't end the way he expected. "You think you're so smart," Kyle said, his voice shaking. "But I know what you're doing. Brooke told me about your little games." Reed smiled, and the expression was colder than anything Kyle had ever seen. "Did she? What else did Brooke tell you?" "She said you've been suspicious for months. She said you hired someone to follow us." "Is that what she said?" Reed stood slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. "Kyle, let me ask you something. Do you really think I would have waited months to confront you if I'd known about the affair?" The question hung in the air as Kyle's limited intelligence struggled to process its implications. Reed continued speaking, his voice calm and conversational. "Do you think a man like me, a man who built his business from nothing, would just sit back and let some trust fund baby steal his wife? Do you think I would have let you humiliate me for 3 months without doing something about it?" Kyle's face went pale as the real scope of his situation began to dawn on him. "No, Kyle. I've known about you and Brooke for exactly 4 days. And in those 4 days, I've destroyed your business project, ended your marriage, and set up the complete demolition of everything you think you own. Because when someone takes something from Reed Morrison, they don't get to keep it. They lose everything." Reed walked around his desk until he was standing inches from Kyle, close enough that the other man could smell the sawdust and concrete that still clung to his clothes despite years of wearing suits. "You wanted to play in my world, Kyle. You wanted to take my wife, my family, my life. Now you get to learn what happens when you steal from someone who has nothing left to lose. Kyle tried to speak, but Reed wasn't finished. This is just the beginning. Before I'm done, you'll lose your business, your marriage, your reputation, and your family's respect. And Brooke? Brooke is going to discover that betraying Reed Morrison was the biggest mistake of her life. Kyle backed toward the door, his earlier rage replaced by something that looked very much like fear. "You're insane," he whispered. Reed smiled again. "No, Kyle. I'm just better at this than you are." Chapter 6. The Web Titans. Brooke Morrison had always believed she was the smartest person in any room. Her affair with Kyle hadn't been just about passion. It had been about power, about having something her husband didn't know about proving to herself that she could manipulate the men in her life without consequences. She'd grown bored with Reed's intensity, his focus on business, his working-class roots that no amount of success could fully polish away. Kyle represented everything Reed wasn't: refined, cultured, born to wealth and privilege. When Kyle looked at her, she saw herself reflected as she wanted to be: sophisticated, desirable, worthy of the finer things in life. The affair had made her feel alive in a way her marriage hadn't for years. But Brooke was about to learn that she'd underestimated her husband in ways that would cost her everything. Reed's campaign against his wife began with surgical precision. He started by quietly liquidating assets, selling stocks, transferring funds, restructuring investments in ways that looked routine but systematically moved money beyond Brooke's reach. Morrison Construction's corporate accounts were reorganized through shell companies. The joint savings account that Brooke rarely monitored was gradually emptied, and the funds moved to accounts in Grace's name, managed by trustees Reed had selected. Brooke noticed nothing. Her credit cards still worked, the household bills were still paid, and she had no reason to monitor their financial situation closely. Reed had always handled the money, and she'd been content to let him manage their wealth as long as she could spend freely. Reed's second move was more psychological. He began documenting Brooke's behavior, her lies, her increasing absence from Grace's life. He installed security cameras throughout their house, ostensibly for protection, but actually to record evidence of Brooke's neglect and deception. He hired a forensic accountant to trace every purchase Brooke made, building a detailed picture of her affair through hotel bills, restaurant charges, and gifts bought for Kyle. But Reed's masterstroke was turning Brooke's own social circle against her. The wealthy wives of Millfield lived on gossip and social position. Reed began carefully seeding information about Brooke's affair, not through direct revelation, but through subtle implications and strategic questions. He mentioned to Carol Fitzgerald, the biggest gossip in their social group, that he'd been concerned about Brooke's Thursday art classes. "She comes home so late, and she never talks about what she's learned. I'm starting to wonder if she's actually enjoying the classes or just needs time away from home." To Jennifer Walsh, whose husband had cheated on her the previous year, Reed expressed worry about Brooke's mood changes. "She seems so happy lately, but distant. Like she's got a secret she's excited about. I hope she's not planning some surprise that we can't afford right now." The beauty of Reed's approach was that he never directly accused Brooke of anything. He simply planted seeds of doubt and let the social network do the rest. Within 2 weeks, half of Millfield elite were speculating about Brooke Morrison's suspicious behavior. When Brooke began receiving cold shoulders at the country club and noticed friends ending conversations when she approached, she initially blamed Reed. She accused him of saying something to damage her reputation, which he denied with perfect honesty. He never directly said anything damaging about her. "Maybe people are just picking up on the tension in our marriage," Reed suggested with fake concern. "You have been distant lately. Working late, those art classes, all that time away from home. People notice when couples grow apart." Brooke's paranoia increased as her social standing eroded. She began snapping at Grace, taking out her frustrations on the one person who couldn't defend herself. Reed documented every incident, every moment of cruelty, every sign that Brooke was an unfit mother. The breaking point came when Brooke made a crucial mistake. Frustrated by her deteriorating social life and convinced that Reed was somehow sabotaging her, she decided to force a confrontation. She told Kyle that they needed to be more public about their relationship, to stop hiding and make their feelings known. Kyle, already reeling from his business failures and Amanda's divorce proceedings, was horrified by the suggestion. He'd been using the affair as an escape from his problems, not as a path to more complications. When Brooke pressed him about leaving their spouses and starting a new life together, Kyle realized that his mistress was far more invested in their relationship than he was. Reed learned about their argument from Blake's surveillance reports. The private investigator had been following both Kyle and Brooke, documenting their meetings and recording their conversations when possible. According to Blake's notes, Brooke had accused Kyle of being a coward, while Kyle had told her she was living in a fantasy if she thought he was going to destroy his life for an affair. The argument marked the beginning of the end for Brooke and Kyle's relationship, but it also gave Reed the opening he'd been waiting for. He arranged for Brooke to discover Kyle's true feelings in the most devastating way possible. Reed hired an actress through a talent agency in Chicago, someone with no connections to Millfield who could play a role convincingly. The woman, who looked remarkably similar to Brooke, was instructed to approach Kyle at his regular bar and claimed to be interested in him. Reed's goal wasn't to make Kyle cheat again. It was to record Kyle's real opinion of Brooke when he thought he was talking to a stranger. The actress, wearing a hidden recording device, engaged Kyle in conversation about relationships and affairs. Within an hour, Kyle was drunkenly confessing that he was stuck with this needy woman who thinks an affair means true love and that he was trying to figure out how to dump her without causing a scene. Reed had the recording enhanced and edited, then arranged for Brooke to receive it anonymously. The package arrived at their house with a note. "Thought you should know what your Thursday lover really thinks of you." When Brooke listened to Kyle's voice describing her as desperate and clingy, something inside her broke. She confronted Kyle that same evening, screaming at him in the Grandview Hotel lobby while a dozen witnesses watched. The scene was everything Reed had hoped for: public, messy, and completely destructive to both their reputations. But Reed wasn't finished with either of them. The recording was just the first phase of his endgame. Soon, Brooke and Kyle would learn that their betrayal had consequences far beyond a broken affair. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Begins. The Sterling family had been Millfield's aristocracy for 3 generations. Bob Sterling's grandfather had founded Sterling Financial Services in 1952, building a reputation for conservative investments and exclusive clientele. Bob had inherited not just a business, but a social position that made him one of the most influential men in the city. The Sterling name opened doors, secured favorable deals, and commanded respect. But Bob Sterling had made the fatal error of believing his own legend. When he'd humiliated Grace Morrison and mocked her father, he'd assumed that Reed would simply absorb the insult like all the other subtle slights he'd endured over the years. Bob had forgotten that beneath Reed's polished exterior was a man who'd grown up fighting for everything he had. The first notice arrived on a Thursday morning, the same day Grace had been forced to clean toilets while her grandparents laughed. The letter was from Sterling Financial Services' own collections department, informing Bob that his home mortgage was in default and demanding immediate payment of the full balance, $2.8 million. Bob's initial reaction was confusion, then anger. He stormed into his office, demanding to know how his own company could be threatening foreclosure on his house. His assistant, Margaret, had been fielding calls all morning from increasingly agitated creditors. "Mr. Sterling, I've been trying to reach you," Margaret said. "We've got a problem. 3 of our major investors are calling in their positions, and they're demanding immediate settlement." Bob's face went white. "Which investors?" "Morrison Holdings, Chicago Capital Group, and Midwest Development Fund. Together, they represent 45% of our capitalization." "That's impossible. Those are all small, independent investors." Margaret handed him a stack of legal documents. "Not anymore, sir. According to these papers, all 3 companies are subsidiaries of a single entity, and that entity is demanding full payment of all outstanding obligations, including your personal mortgage, within 30 days. Bob sat down heavily, his mind racing. He'd structured his personal mortgage through Sterling Financial as a tax strategy, never imagining that someone could acquire enough of his company to threaten his control. The terms of the investment agreements were coming back to him. Terms he'd agreed to because the interest rates were so favorable and the investors had seemed so passive. "Who owns the parent company?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Margaret consulted her notes. The documents list Reed Morrison as the primary shareholder. The phone rang before Bob could process the full implications. Margaret answered, then held out the receiver with a look of dread. "It's Mr. Morrison for you." Bob took the phone with a shaking hand. "Reed?" "Hello, Bob." Reed's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I assume you've received the notices by now." "Reed, there must be some mistake. You can't just—" "Actually, I can. You see, Bob, 6 months ago when you needed capital for that shopping center development, you sold equity in your company to what you thought were anonymous investors. But those investors were me. I now own 45% of Sterling Financial Services, which means I have significant influence over company policy." Bob's mouth went dry. "What do you want?" "I want you to remember something, Bob. Do you remember last Tuesday evening? Do you remember what you said to my 3-year-old daughter?" The silence stretched between them as Bob realized that Reed knew about Grace's humiliation. "Reed, that was just— Grace needed to learn. Grace needed to learn that her grandfather thinks she's worthless because she shares my blood. Grace needed to learn that her grandmother finds her breeding inferior. And Grace needed to learn that her mother thinks watching her suffer is entertaining." Bob's voice became desperate. "Reed, please, we can work this out. It was a misunderstanding." "No, Bob. It was exactly what it appeared to be. You humiliated my daughter because you thought I was weak enough to let you get away with it. You were wrong." Reed's voice remained steady, but Bob could hear something dangerous underneath the calm tone. "Here's what's going to happen, Bob. You have 30 days to pay the full balance of your mortgage, plus penalties and fees. If you can't pay, the house goes to auction. And since I control the foreclosure process through my stake in your company, I'll make sure the auction happens very quickly and very publicly. That house has been in my family for 40 years, and Grace is my family. The difference is I protect what's mine." The line went dead, leaving Bob staring at the phone in his hand. Around him, the Sterling Financial Services offices that had been his kingdom for 20 years suddenly felt like a tomb. Meanwhile, Pat Sterling was discovering that her social position was far more fragile than she'd imagined. The country club, where she'd reigned as queen bee for decades, was buzzing with gossip about the Sterling family's financial troubles. Word had somehow leaked that Bob's house was in foreclosure, and the wealthy wives who'd once competed for Pat's approval were now avoiding her with a ruthless efficiency that only the social elite could manage. But Reed wasn't content to simply destroy the Sterling house. He'd been planning something far more personal, far more devastating. As Pat sat in her garden room, the same room where she'd watched Grace cry, she had no idea that her world was about to become much smaller and much more dangerous. The knock on the door came at sunset. Pat opened it to find 2 men in work clothes standing on her porch. Behind them, she could see a Morrison construction truck in the driveway. "Mrs. Sterling? We're here about the renovation work." "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. We haven't scheduled any renovation work." The foreman, Danny Rodriguez, consulted his clipboard. "According to our work order, we're here to begin demolition on the garden room. Something about structural damage that makes it unsafe for occupancy." Pat's heart began racing. "That's impossible. This house was just inspected last year." Danny shrugged. "Ma'am, I just do what the work order says. And the work order says this room is condemned and needs to be demolished immediately for safety reasons." As Pat watched in horror, the demolition crew began setting up equipment around the garden room where she'd humiliated her granddaughter. The room where she'd taught Grace that her father's blood made her inferior was about to be reduced to rubble. "You can't do this!" Pat screamed. "This is my house." Danny looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Actually, ma'am, according to the foreclosure notice, this house belongs to Sterling Financial Services. And Sterling Financial Services contracted Morrison Construction to handle the demolition." As the first sledgehammer blow shattered the French doors, Pat Sterling finally understood that she'd made an enemy of the wrong man. Reed Morrison hadn't just taken their house. He was personally destroying the room where they'd broken his daughter's heart. The war had begun, and the Sterlings were losing badly. Chapter 8, Total Warfare. Kyle Brennan thought he'd reached the bottom when Amanda filed for divorce and his business project collapsed. He was wrong. Reed Morrison was just getting started. Reed's assault on Kyle began with precision strikes designed to isolate and humiliate him. The first blow came through Kyle's business relationships. Reed had spent years building connections throughout the construction and development industry, and he began calling in favors with surgical efficiency. Contractors who'd worked with Brennan Development for years suddenly became unavailable. Suppliers experienced mysterious delays in delivering materials. City inspectors found new violations on projects that had previously passed inspection. Within 2 weeks, Kyle's remaining developments were hemorrhaging money and facing costly delays. But Reed's psychological warfare was even more devastating. He arranged for Kyle to be constantly reminded of his mistakes through a campaign of subtle torment. Flowers were delivered to Kyle's office every day, funeral arrangements with cards that read, "In memory of your marriage," and "Condolences on your loss." Hotel room keys from the Grandview arrived in Kyle's mail with notes suggesting he might want to revisit happier times alone. The genius of Reed's approach was that nothing he did was technically illegal. The flowers could be explained as a prank. The room keys could be dismissed as a hotel marketing mistake. But the cumulative effect was driving Kyle toward a paranoid breakdown. Kyle tried to fight back through legal channels, but Reed had anticipated this move. When Kyle's lawyers attempted to trace the harassment back to Reed, they found only dead ends. The flower orders were placed through untraceable accounts. The hotel keys were sent from anonymous mailers. Every attempt to prove Reed's involvement failed, leaving Kyle looking increasingly unstable to anyone who tried to help him. The final blow came when Reed destroyed Kyle's relationship with his father, Harrison Brennan. Harrison was old school, a man who'd built Brennan Development through personal relationships and handshake deals. He valued reputation above profit and had been quietly horrified by the scandals surrounding his son's divorce and business failures. Reed arranged a meeting with Harrison under the pretense of discussing a potential partnership between Morrison Construction and Brennan Development. The meeting took place at the Millfield Country Club, where Reed had carefully orchestrated an audience of influential businessmen. "Harrison, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," Reed said as they settled into leather chairs in the club's main dining room. "Of course, Reed. Though I have to admit, I'm surprised you want to work with us, given recent developments." Reed nodded gravely. "I believe in separating business from personal matters. Kyle's problems are his own, but Brennan Development has a reputation worth preserving." Harrison relaxed slightly. "I'm glad you see it that way. Kyle's been going through a difficult time, but he's learning from his mistakes. Actually, Harrison, that's what I wanted to discuss with you." Reed's voice remained friendly, but something in his tone made Harrison tense. "I'm concerned that Kyle's judgment might be affecting the company's reputation more than you realize." Reed opened a folder and placed several photographs on the table between them. The images showed Kyle and Brooke entering the Grandview Hotel, Kyle drinking heavily at various bars, and Kyle arguing with contractors on his failed development project. "These were taken over the past 3 months, Reed explained. "I had my security team investigate before considering a partnership. I think you should know what your son has been up to." Harrison's face went gray as he studied the photos. His son's affair was bad enough, but the images of Kyle drunk and belligerent at business meetings were devastating to a man who'd built his reputation on professionalism and integrity. "Reed, I had no idea it was this bad." "There's more," Reed said quietly. He produced a recording device and pressed play. Kyle's voice filled the space between them, slurred with alcohol and full of contempt. "The old man thinks he's some kind of business genius, but Brennan Development is living in the past. When I take over, I'm going to modernize everything. Get rid of all these handshake deals and personal relationship bullshit. It's all about profit margins and tax advantages." Harrison's hands shook as he listened to his son mock everything he'd spent his life building. The recording continued with Kyle bragging about his affair, his contempt for old money rules, and his plans to sell off the company's legacy properties for quick profits. Where did you get this? Harrison whispered. Kyle recorded himself. Reed lied smoothly. He was making notes for a presentation to potential investors. I thought you should hear it before he approaches your clients. The conversation was actually from one of Reed's sessions with the actress who'd approached Kyle, but Harrison had no way of knowing that. To him, it sounded like his son had betrayed everything the Brennan name represented. Reed leaned forward, his voice sympathetic. Harrison, I've been where you are. When someone you trust betrays your values, it feels like the ground is shifting under your feet. But you have a choice to make. You can let Kyle destroy everything you've built, or you can take steps to protect your legacy. Harrison looked around the dining room, at the other businessmen who were pretending not to listen but obviously hanging on every word. The humiliation of having his family's dirty laundry exposed in front of his peers was almost unbearable. What would you do? Harrison asked quietly. I'd make it clear that Kyle's behavior doesn't represent Brennan Development's values. I'd distance the company from his personal failures. And I'd make sure that everyone knows the difference between Kyle Brennan and Harrison Brennan. By the end of their lunch, Harrison had effectively disowned his son. He announced to the assembled businessmen that Kyle would no longer represent Brennan Development in any capacity, and that the company was severing all ties with Kyle's independent ventures. Kyle learned about his father's decision through a phone call that lasted less than 30 seconds. Harrison's voice was cold and final. You're no longer my son or my business partner. Don't contact me again. When Kyle tried to argue, to explain that he was being set up, Harrison simply hung up. The Brennan family fortune, the trust fund that had supported Kyle his entire life, the business connections that had made his career possible, all of it was gone in an instant. Kyle sat in his empty office, staring at the phone in his hand, finally understanding the full scope of Reed Morrison's revenge. He'd lost his wife, his business, his family, and his future. And Reed wasn't finished with him yet. Chapter 9. The Final Judgment. 6 months after Reed Morrison had overheard his daughter being humiliated, the pieces of his revenge were falling into place with devastating precision. The Sterling house had been auctioned off for a fraction of its value, purchased by a shell company that Reed controlled and immediately demolished. Bob Sterling's financial empire had collapsed when other investors, spooked by the foreclosure scandal, began withdrawing their funds. Pat Sterling, stripped of her social position and financial security, had been forced to move into a modest apartment in the least fashionable part of town. Kyle Brennan was living in a studio apartment above a convenience store, his trust fund gone, his business destroyed, his family name ruined. Amanda's divorce settlement had taken half of his remaining assets, and his father's disownment had eliminated any hope of financial recovery. He spent his days working as a clerk in a hardware store, a job Reed had arranged through connections, not out of mercy, but to ensure Kyle experienced the kind of manual labor he'd always considered beneath him. But Reed's masterpiece was reserved for Brooke. The divorce proceedings had been swift and brutal. Reed's team of lawyers, armed with evidence of Brooke's affair, her neglect of Grace, and her participation in the child's humiliation, had secured full custody and left Brooke with virtually nothing. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed, confident in her ability to manipulate Reed indefinitely, had protected his business assets from division. Reed had played one final card that destroyed any sympathy Brooke might have claimed. The security cameras he'd installed in their home had captured Brooke's treatment of Grace during the months of the affair. Moments of casual cruelty, emotional neglect, and verbal abuse that painted a picture of a mother who viewed her own child as an obstacle to her happiness. When the recordings were played in family court, even Brooke's own lawyer had advised her to accept Reed's terms without further contest. The judge, a family man himself, had been visibly disgusted by Brooke's behavior and had terminated her parental rights entirely. Now Reed sat in his home office, Grace playing quietly with her toys in the adjoining room, reviewing the final reports from Trevor Blake. His revenge was complete, but he felt no satisfaction, only the cold certainty that justice had been served. The knock on his door came at exactly 8 o'clock. Reed opened it to find Brooke standing on his porch, looking haggard and desperate. 6 months of consequences had aged her years. Her designer clothes had been replaced by discount store outfits. Her perfect makeup was smudged, and her once confident posture had collapsed into defeated slouching. "Reed, please," she began. "I need to see Grace. She's my daughter." Reed stepped outside, closing the door behind him to ensure Grace couldn't hear the conversation. His voice was calm, emotionless. "Grace is my daughter. The court was very clear about that." "I made mistakes," Brooke said, tears streaming down her face. "I was stupid. I was selfish, but I love her. I love you. We can work this out." Reed studied his former wife with the same detachment he'd once applied to construction blueprints. Brooke had been beautiful once, charming, everything he'd thought he wanted. Now he could see her clearly, a woman whose love was conditional, whose loyalty was for sale, whose cruelty emerged whenever she thought no one was watching. "Brooke, do you remember what you said that night at your parents' house? When you watched Grace cry while your father called her a loser like me?" Brooke's face crumpled. "I didn't mean it. I was angry at you, and I took it out on her. It was wrong, but people make mistakes." "You laughed," Reed said quietly. "Your 3-year-old daughter was being humiliated, and you laughed. That wasn't a mistake, Brooke. That was who you really are. People can change." Brooke's voice became desperate. "I can be better. I can be the wife you need, the mother Grace deserves." Reed shook his head. "You had 3 years to be the mother Grace deserved. You chose to be Kyle Brennan's mistress instead." From inside the house came Grace's voice calling for her daddy. Reed smiled at the sound, the first genuine emotion he'd shown since Brooke arrived. "Grace doesn't ask about you anymore," he said. "She's forgotten what it feels like to walk on eggshells around her own mother. She's happy now. You turned her against me. I didn't have to. Children remember how they're treated, Brooke. Grace remembers your impatience, your absence, your cruelty. She's better off without you." Brooke fell to her knees on the porch, sobbing. "Please, Reed. I'll do anything. I'll sign whatever you want, agree to any terms. Just let me be part of her life." Reed looked down at the woman who'd once been his wife, who'd borne his child, who'd betrayed them both for the excitement of an affair. For a moment, he almost felt pity. Then he remembered Grace's tear-stained face as she tried to clean a toilet while the adults in her life mocked her for existing. "No," he said simply. "Grace deserves better than a mother who views her as a burden. She deserves better than a mother who would humiliate her for entertainment. And she deserves better than a mother who would trade her family for a few months of excitement with another man." Reed turned toward the door, then paused. "Brooke, you asked me once why I worked so hard, why I was so driven to succeed. I told you it was about security, about building something that would last. But that wasn't the whole truth." He faced her one final time. "I worked hard because I remembered what it felt like to be powerless. I remembered what it felt like when people could hurt me and I had no way to fight back. I built an empire so that when someone tried to destroy what I loved, I could destroy them in return." Brooke's sobs echoed in the quiet suburban evening as Reed went back inside to his daughter. Through the window, Grace could see the woman on the porch, but she showed no recognition, no desire to go outside. To Grace, Brooke was just a stranger who was upset about something that had nothing to do with her. Reed knelt beside his daughter and pulled her into his arms. She smelled like soap and innocence, like everything worth protecting in the world. "Daddy, who was that lady?" Grace asked. Reed smoothed her blonde curls and kissed her forehead. "Nobody important, sweetheart. Nobody important at all." Outside, Brooke finally stood and walked away from the house where she'd once lived, from the family she'd destroyed through her own choices. She had no money, no prospects, no support system. Kyle Brennan, the man she'd traded her family for, wouldn't return her calls. Her parents, ruined by their association with her betrayal, had made it clear she was no longer welcome in their lives. Reed Morrison had kept his promise. Everyone who had betrayed him, everyone who had hurt his daughter, had paid a price far beyond what they'd imagined possible. He'd proven that power wasn't just about money. It was about the will to use that money without mercy when mercy wasn't deserved. As Brooke disappeared into the darkness, Reed Morrison closed the door on the past and focused on the future. He had a daughter to raise, a business to run,